On the morning that shattered his world, Daniel stood in the kitchen watching his children laugh over spilled cereal. Their faces were familiar, freckles like his mother's, eyes that mirrored his own. But a lingering doubt gnawed at him, a doubt planted by a whisper he could no longer ignore. It started innocuously, a comment from an old friend at a reunion. "Funny," they had said, "your youngest has Martin's nose. You remember Martin, right? From college?" Daniel had laughed it off then, but the name echoed in his mind, a name tied to late nights and old stories, a name tied to his wife. Emily, before they were ever Daniel and Emily, curiosity became suspicion, and suspicion demanded truth. One by one, he gathered the strands: old photos, a misplaced letter, Emily's uneasy glances when certain names came up, until the day he held the DNA test results, his hands trembling. 2 out of 3. 2 out of 3 children were not his. The paper crumpled under his grip, the laughter from the kitchen now cruel and mocking. How long had she known? How long? Had she lied? He confronted her that evening, his voice a cold whisper, the words like shards of glass. "I know." Emily's face went pale, her mouth opening and closing without sound. She knew exactly what he meant. Who? His voice broke. Who are they really from? Tears welled up, but he felt no sympathy. Not now, not after this. "Martin. And someone else," she confessed, her words choked, eyes pleading. "Someone else." His knees threatened to buckle. It wasn't just one lie. It was years of lies, woven so tightly into his life he could no longer see the truth. "Why?" he demanded, his voice echoing through the house that no longer felt like his home. Emily looked away, shame and fear shadowing her face. "I was lonely. You were always working. And they were there. They gave me attention when you didn't." Rage and hurt collided within him, but he couldn't bring himself to lash out. The children were upstairs, innocent. They didn't know. They didn't deserve his anger. "I need time," he whispered, his voice hollow. He left that night. The faces of the children, his children, even if they weren't by blood, haunting him. Daniel's world unraveled in the days that followed. He became a detective in his own life, piecing together the fragments of Emily's deception. He met Martin, a broken man who admitted to the affair but had no idea about the child. He tracked down the someone else, a stranger who barely remembered Emily's name, but remembered the night that changed everything. Every conversation, every confession added to his torment, but he couldn't stop. He needed the full truth, even if it destroyed him. When he finally returned home, Emily was waiting, hollow-eyed and exhausted. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I never meant to hurt you. Or them." He looked at her, the woman he once loved more than life itself, now a stranger in his eyes. "You didn't just hurt me," he said quietly. "You betrayed them. You took away their right to know who they are." Emily collapsed into tears, but he felt no pity. Not yet. Maybe not ever. He stayed for the children. Even if they weren't his by blood, they were his in every other way that mattered. They needed him now more than ever. But Emily, she was already gone. The divorce was quiet, civil. She moved out, leaving behind the echoes of her lies. Daniel remained, raising the children he still called his own, even when the truth said otherwise. Years later, as they grew, they asked questions, and Daniel told them the truth. Not the whole truth, not yet, but enough to make them understand they were loved, no matter what. He never forgave Emily, but he found peace, in his own way, in the faces of the children who were his, even if they weren't. And sometimes, late at night, he wondered if he ever really knew her at all. Days turned into nights, sleepless and heavy, as Daniel grappled with the choice that threatened to tear his world apart. The burden of truth lay on his shoulders, a crushing weight that seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. He tried to bury himself in work, in routines, in anything that would drown out the constant echo of Martin's words. I just want to do the right thing, for him. But there was no escaping it. Every time he looked at his son, so full of life, so trusting, so blissfully unaware of the tangled web that held his world together, the guilt gnawed at him. His son deserved more than lies. He deserved to know who he was. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of pink and orange, Daniel stood at the edge of his backyard, staring at the swing set he had built with his own hands. His son's laughter still echoed in his ears from earlier that day, a sound so pure it brought tears to his eyes. Emily approached, her footsteps soft, cautious. She stood beside him, her arms wrapped around herself. I heard. Martin showed up again, she said, her voice laced with worry. Daniel's jaw tightened. He won't let it go. He wants to be a part of his life. She looked down, guilt evident in her posture. I never wanted this. I never wanted to hurt you, or him. Her voice cracked, and she hugged herself tighter. I don't know how to fix this. There's no fixing it, Daniel snapped, his voice colder than he intended. He saw her flinch, her shoulders sagging. He sighed, the anger draining away, leaving only exhaustion. There's only surviving it. They stood in silence, the weight of the truth pressing down on them. Finally, Emily whispered, Are you going to tell him? Daniel didn't answer right away. His gaze remained fixed on the swing, swaying gently in the evening breeze. I don't know, he admitted, his voice hollow. But he deserves to know. One day, Emily wiped at her eyes. I ruined everything, didn't I? Daniel looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time he saw beyond his own pain. He saw her fear, her regret, the consequences of her choices etched into every line on her face. But he also saw the woman he had once loved, the mother of his children, and the person who was just as lost as he was. Yes, he said softly, but we're both paying the price. She broke down then, her body shaking with silent sobs. But Daniel didn't reach out, didn't comfort her. He couldn't. The wound was still too raw, but he didn't walk away either. He stood there, letting her cry, because despite everything, they were in this together. The days that followed were a blur of routine and uncertainty. Daniel watched his son closely, searching for any sign that the boy might already sense the truth. But his son continued to laugh, to play, to call him Dad, without a second thought. The innocence was beautiful, and it broke Daniel's heart. Then, one evening, the phone rang. It was Martin. I've decided to leave town, Martin said, his voice strained. I can't keep doing this. Hurting you, hurting him. Maybe it's better if he never knows. Daniel felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. Martin was giving up his claim, choosing to walk away. But with that choice came another weight. Now the decision to tell the truth rested solely on Daniel's shoulders. Are you sure? Daniel asked, his voice cautious. Martin hesitated, his pain evident even over the phone. No, but I think it's what's best. I made my bed. Now I have to lie in it. He took a shaky breath. Just take care of him. Love him enough for both of us. And then the line went dead. Daniel stood there, phone still in his hand, feeling the world shift beneath him. The choice was his now. He could keep the secret, protect his son's innocence, give him the life he always knew. Or he could tell the truth and risk shattering that innocence forever. That night, Daniel sat at the edge of his son's bed, watching him sleep. He reached out, brushing a stray curl from the boy's forehead. "I love you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "No matter what, you'll always be my son." The boy stirred, his eyes fluttering open, a sleepy smile forming. "Love you too, Dad." He yawned, rolling over, slipping back into dreams. Daniel sat there for a long time, his heart aching. The truth burned within him, a weight he would carry alone. For now. For as long as he could. Because love, he realized, was more than biology. It was choice. It was sacrifice. It was putting his son's happiness above his own pain. For now, the truth could wait. But one day, he would find the right words, the right moment. Until then, he would be the father his son needed, no matter what blood said otherwise. And so he rose, pressing a gentle kiss to his son's forehead before walking away, knowing that some secrets were too heavy to carry forever. But he would carry them just the same, for love, for family, for his son. The days blended together, a delicate balance of routine and pretense. Daniel did his best to keep things normal, weekend trips to the park, helping with homework, bedtime stories. He became an expert at masking his turmoil behind smiles and laughter, shielding his son from the pain that simmered just beneath the surface. But secrets have a way of seeping through the cracks. One Saturday afternoon, as Daniel was cleaning out the garage, he heard his son's voice, curious and innocent, from behind him. "Dad, who was that man that came by last month?" Daniel froze, his grip tightening on the old baseball glove he was holding. He turned slowly, forcing his face into a neutral expression. "Which man, buddy?" "The man with the sad eyes," his son said, frowning as he tried to remember. "He looked at me funny, like he was about to cry." Daniel's heart sank. Martin's visit had left an impression. He should have known better than to think his son wouldn't notice. "Oh, him," Daniel said, his voice steady. "He was just someone from work. Nothing to worry about." His son seemed to accept the answer, his face relaxing as he returned to playing with his toy truck. But Daniel's chest tightened. The lie sat heavy on his tongue, bitter and cold. Later that night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Daniel realized that the secret was growing, spreading like poison. It wasn't just his burden to bear, it was affecting his son, too. And if Martin ever came back, if the truth ever came out in some other way, Daniel couldn't control the fallout. He needed to talk to Emily. They had to be on the same page. The next evening, after the kids were asleep, Daniel found Emily in the kitchen, washing dishes. He leaned against the doorway, his arms crossed. "We need to talk." Emily looked up, her eyes wary. "About what?" "About him," Daniel said, his voice low. "He asked about Martin today." Emily's face went pale, the plate slipping from her fingers and clattering into the sink. What did he say?" "He called him the man with the sad eyes," Daniel said, his voice cracking. "He's remembering things. He's noticing." He took a shaky breath. "We can't keep lying to him forever." Emily shook her head, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the sink. "He's just a kid. He doesn't need to know. Not yet." "But one day he will," Daniel insisted, his frustration bubbling over. "And if he finds out from someone else? If Martin decides to come back?" He paused, his voice breaking. "It'll destroy him." Emily looked away, tears glistening in her eyes. "I never wanted this," she whispered. "I never wanted to hurt anyone." "Well, it's too late for that," Daniel said, his voice sharper than he intended. He softened when he saw her flinch, guilt flashing across her face. "I'm not saying we tell him everything now, but we need to be prepared. We need to figure out how to do this right." Emily sank into a chair, her shoulders sagging. "How do you tell a child that his dad isn't really his dad?" Her voice was hollow, broken. "How do you break his heart like that?" Daniel walked over, his movements slow, deliberate. He sat across from her, his eyes locking onto hers. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But we owe him the truth. Someday." They sat in silence, the weight of the secret pressing down on them, binding them together and tearing them apart all at once. The days passed, and the conversation hung between them, an unspoken agreement, a shared burden. They continued their charade, pretending that everything was fine, that the family was whole. But Daniel knew it was only a matter of time before the truth surfaced. Then, one afternoon, his son came home from school, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Dad, what's adoption?" Daniel's heart stopped. "Where did you hear that word?" "Some kids at school," his son whispered, his voice trembling. They said that sometimes dads aren't really dads, that they're just pretending." He looked up, his eyes searching Daniel's face. "Are you pretending?" Daniel felt the world crumble around him. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He saw the fear in his son's eyes, the confusion, the heartbreak. And in that moment, Daniel realized that the truth could no longer wait. The secret had grown too big, too heavy. It was time to face it. He took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. "Come here, buddy," he said, his voice shaking. He pulled his son into his lap, holding him close. "There's something I need to tell you, something very important." His son looked up, his eyes wide, trusting. "What is it, Dad?" Daniel felt the tears burning his eyes, his heart shattering as he prepared to speak the words that would change everything. "No matter what I say, no matter what you hear, I will always be your dad. Always. Nothing will ever change that." His son frowned, his small hands gripping Daniel's shirt. "I don't understand." Months passed, the seasons changing as Daniel's family navigated their new reality. The days were filled with difficult conversations, counseling sessions, and moments of raw vulnerability. Yet, in the midst of the pain, there were glimpses of hope. A shared laugh over breakfast, a hug that lingered just a little longer, a quiet understanding that they were all trying to move forward. Daniel's relationship with his son grew stronger than ever. Honesty had forged a bond unbreakable by blood. They spent afternoons at the park, playing catch and talking about everything from school projects to the confusing concept of biological fathers. Daniel answered every question with patience, even when it hurt, even when he wanted to shield his son from the complexity of it all. Martin respected the boundaries Daniel set. He met his son cautiously, gently, never overstepping, always deferring to Daniel's role as dad. They started with short meetings, an hour at the park, an ice cream after school. Daniel was there every time, quietly watching from a distance, his heart aching, but also relieved at Martin's respect and understanding. It was a delicate dance, a balancing act between the past and the present, between what was lost and what could still be built. As for Emily, she faced her own demons. She had been exposed, her lies unraveled, her betrayals laid bare. But she didn't run. She stayed, fighting to rebuild the trust she had shattered. She attended therapy sessions, confessed her fears, her mistakes, and confronted the choices that had led her to this point. One evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in shades of gold and pink, Emily found Daniel sitting on the back porch, his eyes distant, his face weary. She hesitated before stepping out, her fingers twisting, nervously. "Daniel, can we talk?" He looked up, his expression guarded but open. "Yeah, sure." She sat beside him, leaving a respectful distance between them. Silence stretched, heavy and tense, before she finally spoke. "I've been doing a lot of thinking about everything, about us, about what I did." Her voice wavered, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want you to know that I'm sorry, truly sorry, for the lies, for the betrayal, for all the pain I caused." Daniel's jaw tightened, his hands clenched into fists. "You didn't just hurt me, Emily. You hurt our kids. You tore apart our family. And you kept me in the dark for years. Years." His voice broke, raw with emotion. "I can't just forget that." Tears rolled down her cheeks, her shoulders sagging under the weight of her guilt. "I know. I don't expect you to. I wanted you to know that I see it now. I see the damage I did, and I'm trying to be better. To be honest, even if it's too late." They sat in silence, the air heavy with words unsaid, with pain unhealed. Then Daniel spoke, his voice low and measured. "I don't know what the future holds for us. I don't know if I can ever trust you again, or if I can ever love you the way I used to. But we're still parents. We still have to raise our kids together. And for them, I'm willing to try." Emily's eyes widened, hope flickering amidst the grief. "Thank you for giving me that chance. I promise. No more lies, no more secrets." He nodded, his gaze distant. "One day at a time. That's all I can promise." They sat together, the sun dipping below the horizon, the darkness settling in. But somewhere in that darkness, there was the faintest glimmer of light. As the months continued, they learned to co-parent, to communicate without the bitterness that once defined their interactions. They attended therapy as a family, confronting the truths that had been buried for so long. They faced awkward holidays, difficult conversations, and moments of deep sadness. But they also found healing, forgiveness, and a new understanding of love. Daniel didn't know if he could ever fully forgive Emily. The pain of her betrayal was still there, an echo that haunted him in quiet moments. But he could see her efforts, her genuine remorse, her determination to rebuild. And he could see the way his children still needed her, still loved her, despite everything. He made peace with the past, not by forgetting, but by accepting that it was part of his story. A story of love and loss, of betrayal and redemption, of family and forgiveness. And as the years passed, they found a new way forward. Not the life Daniel had once dreamed of, but a life he could live with. A life where truth and love coexisted, however messy and complicated they might be. A life where he was still a father, still a man, still moving forward, one day at a time. Years went by, and the scars of betrayal gradually faded, replaced by a tapestry of hard-earned resilience and fragile hope. The children grew older, their laughter echoing through the house once more, though tinged with a maturity that belied their age. They understood, in ways children shouldn't have to, that love and trust could be fractured but didn't have to be shattered forever. Daniel and Emily learned to coexist peacefully. They maintained a delicate balance, a partnership built on necessity and mutual respect rather than romance. They showed up to school events together, cheered at soccer games, and attended parent-teacher conferences as a united front. Their roles as mother and father remained steadfast, even as their identities as husband and wife were irreparably altered. One evening, as Daniel was sorting through old photo albums in the attic, his son came in, his face thoughtful. "Dad, do you still love Mom?" Daniel's heart clenched, his fingers tightening around a faded photograph of him and Emily, smiling on a beach from a lifetime ago. He took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I'll always care about her. She gave me you and your siblings. We made a family together. But sometimes, love changes. It doesn't go away, but it changes. His son nodded slowly, his young mind processing the complexities of grown-up emotions. Will you ever get back together? The question hung, heavy in the air. Daniel looked at his son, at the hope and fear warring in his eyes. I don't know. But no matter what happens, we're still a family. That's something that won't change. As his son hugged him tightly, Daniel realized that this was enough. He didn't need all the answers. He just needed to be there, to show up, to keep moving forward. Months later, a letter arrived in the mail. It was from Martin. He was moving out of state, taking a new job that would allow him to provide for his son while maintaining respectful boundaries. He wrote about how grateful he was for Daniel's acceptance, for allowing him to be present without disruption. Daniel sat on the porch, the letter resting on his lap, a bittersweet smile playing on his lips. It was a reminder that life was full of changes, of people coming and going, of relationships evolving. Emily came out, her expression cautious. Is everything okay? Yeah. It's from Martin. He's moving away. Her eyes softened, guilt, flickering before she looked away. I didn't expect that, Daniel nodded. Neither did I. But it's probably for the best. Less confusion for our son, fewer complications. They stood in silence, the weight of the past heavy between them. Then Emily spoke, her voice hesitant. I've been thinking about us, about the future. I know I've caused so much pain, but I still want to try. I want to fix what I broke, if you'll let me. Daniel looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw the vulnerability, the hope, and the regret etched into her face. He felt the familiar ache, the memories of love and betrayal tangled together. I forgave you a long time ago, Emily. For my sake, not yours. But I don't know. If we can go back to what we were. Too much has changed. I've changed. He paused, his voice steady. But maybe we can find a new way forward. Not as husband and wife, but as partners, as parents. Tears glistened in her eyes, a sad smile touching her lips. I'd like that. I'd like that a lot. They stood together, looking out at the yard where their children played, laughing and chasing fireflies as dusk settled in. It wasn't a perfect ending. It wasn't even the ending Daniel had once dreamed of. But it was real. It was honest. And it was enough. As the fireflies danced in the evening light, Daniel realized that sometimes healing didn't come with grand gestures or neat resolutions. Sometimes it was found in the small moments, in quiet acceptance, in choosing to keep moving forward, one day at a time. And for now, that was more than enough. Life moved on day by day as Daniel and Emily navigated their new normal. They attended counseling, not to salvage their marriage, but to learn how to communicate without reopening old wounds. They built boundaries, established routines, and grew comfortable in their roles as co-parents. It was awkward at first, but gradually they found a rhythm. Daniel threw himself into his work, taking on more challenging projects at the firm. It helped to have a purpose outside the home, a way to keep his mind occupied and his heart guarded. Yet, he always made time for the children, coaching Little League and attending recitals, ensuring they knew they were loved no matter what had happened between him and Emily. One evening, as he sat on the bleachers watching his daughter's soccer game, a familiar voice called out. He turned to see Sophie, an old friend from college, waving as she made her way over. They had lost touch over the years, life pulling them in different directions. "Hey, stranger," she greeted, her smile warm and genuine. "I thought that was you. It's been ages." Daniel felt a smile break through. "Sophie." "Wow, it's good to see you. What brings you here?" "My niece is playing. I try to catch her games when I can." She glanced over at the field, then back at him. What about you? I didn't know you were back in town. Yeah, moved back a few years ago. Life's been complicated, he admitted, a bittersweet laugh escaping. Sophie's eyes softened with understanding. I heard about you and Emily. I'm sorry, Daniel. That's rough. He looked down, kicking at the dirt beneath the bleachers. Yeah, rough is an understatement. But we're figuring it out. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the shouts of children and the whistle of the referee filling the air. Then Sophie spoke again, her voice cautious. I always admired how committed you were to your family, how loyal you were to her. Daniel felt a lump in his throat. Yeah. Sometimes loyalty is the problem. It keeps you hanging on long after you should have let go. Sophie placed a hand on his arm, a reassuring touch. Or maybe it shows how much heart you have. Don't let that change. They exchanged numbers before the game ended, promising to catch up over coffee. It felt good to reconnect, to talk to someone who knew him before everything fell apart. Weeks passed, and Sophie became a regular presence in his life. They shared dinners, reminisced about college, and laughed over old inside jokes. She never pried, never judged. She simply listened, offering a friendship that Daniel hadn't realized he needed. One evening, after a long dinner filled with laughter and easy conversation, Daniel walked Sophie to her car. They stood under the street lamp, the night air crisp and cool. She looked at him, her eyes warm and searching. Daniel, do you think you'll ever be able to trust again? She asked softly. His chest tightened, the weight of the past pressing down. I don't know. Some days it feels impossible. But then I see my kids smile, and I think, maybe one day. Sophie's smile was tender, understanding. Then I'll wait. However long it takes. I'll be here. As she drove away, Daniel stood on the curb, his heart conflicted. It was terrifying to think about opening himself up again, to risk the hurt and betrayal. But Sophie was different. She was safe. She was real. He looked up at the night sky, the stars scattered like diamonds against the velvet darkness. And for the first time in a long time, he felt the stirrings of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, there was life after betrayal. That love, even in a different form, was still possible. And as he walked back to his car, he realized he was ready to find out. One step at a time, one day at a time. The days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Daniel and Sophie's friendship deepened, built on laughter, shared memories, and quiet conversations that stretched late into the night. They never rushed, never labeled what they were becoming. It was unspoken, but understood. Daniel was healing, and Sophie was patient. Emily noticed the change in him. He was lighter somehow, more present with the children, less guarded. At first, it stung, the realization that his happiness no longer depended on her. But in time, she accepted it, recognizing that this was part of the consequences she had to live with. One evening, after dropping the kids off at Daniel's house, Emily hesitated at the door. Can we talk? Daniel leaned against the doorway, his expression neutral. Sure. They sat at the kitchen table, the familiar space echoing with memories of late-night chats and shared meals. Emily took a deep breath, her fingers twisting nervously. I heard you're seeing Sophie. Daniel's eyebrows lifted. From the kids? They mentioned she came to one of their games, and that you've been spending a lot of time with her. He met her gaze steadily. We're friends. And yes, we've been spending time together. Why? Emily's shoulders sagged. I don't know. I guess it just hit me that you're moving on, that you're really letting go. Daniel's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. I had to, Emily. You made that choice for me a long time ago. She winced, guilt flashing across her face. I know. And I'm not here to make this about me. I wanted to say I'm glad. You deserve to be happy. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Daniel leaned back, his eyes softening. I never thought I'd be able to feel happy again. Not after everything. But Sophie, she makes it easier. She makes me feel normal. Emily's eyes grew misty, and she smiled sadly. She's a good person. I'm glad it's her. Daniel looked at his ex-wife, the woman who had once been his world, and felt an unexpected wave of gratitude. For the good years, for their children, for the lessons learned. I don't hate you, Emily. Not anymore. I don't think I ever truly did. I couldn't forgive you. But I've accepted it. All of it. Tears rolled down her cheeks. That's more than I deserve. Thank you. They sat in silence, the weight of forgiveness and acceptance hanging between them. When Emily finally stood to leave, she looked lighter, her shoulders no longer burdened by shame. Good night, Daniel. Good night, Emily. As the door closed, Daniel felt an unfamiliar sense of peace. He hadn't realized how much he needed that conversation, that closure. Weeks later, on a cool autumn evening, Daniel and Sophie sat on a park bench, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The air was crisp, leaves swirling around them in a golden dance. Sophie turned to him, her eyes searching. Do you ever think about the future? About what comes next? Daniel looked at her, his heart thudding in his chest. I think about it every day, and lately, I see you in it. Her breath caught, her eyes widening. Daniel, I'm scared, he admitted, his voice trembling. I'm terrified of getting hurt again, of trusting someone with my heart. But I'm more scared of losing you, of never knowing what we could be. Sophie's eyes softened, her hand reaching for his. I'm not her. I won't hurt you like that. I know. His fingers tightened around hers. And I'm ready to try, to take that risk, if you are. A tear slipped down her cheek, a smile breaking through. I've been ready, Daniel. I've been ready for a long time. As the sun disappeared, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Daniel leaned in, his lips meeting hers in a gentle, tender kiss. It was a beginning, a chance to build something new, something beautiful out of the ashes of his past. For the first time in years, Daniel allowed himself to hope, to dream, to love. And as they sat together, wrapped in each other's warmth, he knew he had finally found his way back to happiness. Months passed, and Daniel and Sophie's relationship blossomed. They took things slowly, savoring each step. First dates, late-night conversations, introducing her gradually to the kids. The children adored Sophie, drawn to her kindness and her infectious laugh. It warmed Daniel's heart to see them bonding, a new kind of family taking shape. Emily observed the changes from a distance, a bittersweet smile on her lips. She was happy for Daniel, genuinely so, even if it meant confronting the reality that they were truly over. Co-parenting became easier, more natural, as they settled into their new roles. They were no longer husband and wife, but they were still a team for their children. One evening, after attending his son's school play, Daniel stood by his car, waiting for Sophie to meet him. Emily approached, her hands tucked into her coat pockets. Hey, he replied, his tone cordial. You did a good job with his costume. He was thrilled. She laughed softly. He wanted to be the fiercest lion on that stage. I just did what I could. There was a pause before she looked up, her eyes sincere. I mean it, Daniel. I'm glad you found her. that you found happiness again." Daniel met her gaze, a mixture of emotions swirling inside him. "I didn't think I ever would, but she makes it easy to believe in love again." Emily nodded, her expression wistful. "I'm glad. Really. You deserve that." Sophie arrived just then, her face lighting up as she saw them. "Hey, wasn't he just the cutest lion?" They shared a laugh, the tension melting away. It was strange but comforting, this new dynamic. As Emily walked to her car, Daniel watched her go, feeling a sense of closure. They had come full circle, from lovers to strangers, and now to friends bound by shared memories and responsibilities. That night, after tucking the kids in, Daniel and Sophie sat on his porch, wrapped in blankets and sipping hot chocolate. The stars sparkled above, the air crisp with the promise of winter. Sophie leaned her head on his shoulder, her voice soft. "I love nights like this. Peaceful, uncomplicated." Daniel kissed her forehead, his heart full. "Me too. I never thought I'd feel this way again, like I could really have a future with someone." She looked up at him, her eyes shining. "You do. With me." It was a simple statement, but it held so much weight, so much promise. Daniel felt tears prick his eyes, overwhelmed by gratitude, by hope. He pulled her closer, his voice breaking. "Thank you for being patient, for waiting for me to heal." "I'd wait forever," she whispered, her lips brushing his. "But I'm glad I don't have to." They sat there, wrapped in each other's arms, watching the stars. It wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but it was real, and it was theirs. And for Daniel, that was enough. It was more than enough. As the months slipped into years, Daniel and Sophie's bond only grew stronger. Their life together felt like a carefully crafted tapestry, each day adding a new, vibrant thread to the intricate design. They had their challenges, of course. No relationship was without its bumps, but they faced them with a calm, steady determination, knowing they were building something worth protecting. Daniel's children grew fond of Sophie, not just as a figure in their father's life, but as someone who genuinely cared for them. She became a constant presence, helping with homework, cooking dinner, attending soccer games and ballet recitals, seamlessly weaving into their world. Sophie wasn't just a girlfriend to Daniel, she became an integral part of their family, too. Sunny Saturday afternoon, as they were picking up groceries for the week, Daniel caught sight of Sophie's face. She was gazing at a display of framed family photos, her fingers brushing against the glass of one with a child's handprint on it. "Do you ever think about having kids of your own?" he asked, his voice low, the question lingering in the air between them. Sophie turned to him, her eyes thoughtful. She smiled, the warmth in her gaze unmistakable. "I think about it a lot, but not just in the way you're probably imagining." She paused for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "I don't need a baby to feel like I'm a part of this family. I already am." Daniel's heart swelled with emotion. He hadn't even realized how much that reassurance meant to him. The idea of adding to their family was something he hadn't dared to dream about, afraid of repeating the same mistakes. But in that moment, it felt like a possibility, something that could someday happen if it was meant to. "I'm glad," he said quietly. "You are a part of this. Of us." Sophie smiled, taking his hand in hers as they continued down the aisle. It was simple, the way they shared those quiet moments together. It was the everyday things, the small gestures, the gentle support that built their future. Later that evening, they sat together on the porch, a gentle breeze rustling the leaves of the trees surrounding the house. The children had gone to bed early, exhausted from their day of playing outside, and the night was peaceful, almost tranquil. Sophie leaned into Daniel, resting her head on his shoulder. Do you think it'll always be like this? He looked down at her, a smile tugging at his lips. I hope so. I really do. The sound of a car engine broke the peaceful silence, and Daniel turned to see Emily's car pulling into the driveway. Sophie straightened, her eyes flickering with a moment of uncertainty, but Daniel squeezed her hand reassuringly. Don't worry, he said softly. We're good. We've come a long way. Emily stepped out of the car, looking tired, but content. She glanced at them both, her eyes softening. Hey, you two. I'm sorry to drop in so late. No problem, Daniel said with a smile. Everything okay? Yeah, Emily replied, her voice a little strained. I don't know. I've been thinking a lot lately about how things have changed, how you and Sophie, how everything turned out. She paused, searching for the right words. I guess I just wanted to say again that I'm happy for you, Daniel. Really, Sophie stood, her demeanor warm but measured. Thank you, Emily. That means a lot. Emily nodded, giving them both a sincere smile. I think we're all finally in a good place. I'm glad the kids have you both. With that, she waved goodbye and headed back to her car, leaving Daniel and Sophie alone once more. As they watched her drive off into the night, a quiet understanding passed between them. They had all come so far. What once seemed impossible, healing, forgiveness, rebuilding, had somehow come to fruition. The wounds of the past were no longer open, but they had shaped who they were today. Sophie took a deep breath, her eyes on Daniel. You know, this feels like the calm after the storm. It does, Daniel agreed, his voice soft. But it's a good calm. The kind that feels like it's meant to last. Sophie smiled, leaning in to kiss him, the world around them fading into the background. For the first time in years, Daniel felt at peace. He had found something real, something solid, something that could withstand whatever came next. As they sat there, the stars overhead, Daniel couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude for everything that had led him here. Every heartbreak, every twist, every moment of despair. It had all led to this. And for the first time in a long time, he was ready to embrace whatever the future held, knowing that he had someone beside him who would face it with him, no matter what. The days that followed felt like an endless sea of questions with no clear answers, a wave of uncertainty crashing against everything Daniel had worked so hard to build. Each time he looked at the children, a gnawing doubt tugged at him. Could this really be true? His mind replayed Emily's words over and over, but they didn't feel real. How could they? Could it be possible that the children he had raised, loved, and protected were not his own flesh and blood? Sophie remained his rock during this storm. She never wavered, not for a moment. She could see the cracks forming in Daniel's heart, but she refused to let him crumble under the weight of this revelation. Her presence was a steady reminder that the future was still theirs to shape. I know this is hard, Sophie said one evening, as Daniel sat in his favorite chair, staring blankly at the television that wasn't on. But we'll take it one step at a time. Whatever you decide to do next, I'm here. Daniel looked at her, his eyes weary. How can I look at them the same way again, Soph? I don't even know where to begin. If some of them aren't mine, how do I even start to process that? She knelt down in front of him, taking his hands into hers. You don't have to figure it all out today, Daniel. You've already been through so much. This isn't your fault. You did what you thought was right. What matters now is how you move forward, with the truth, whatever that turns out to be. And I'll be with you every step of the way. That night, after the children went to bed, Daniel found himself sitting at the kitchen table, his mind consumed with swirling thoughts. What if Emily was right? What if this truth upended his entire life? But what if it didn't? How could he even begin to approach a situation like this? He needed answers. He needed certainty. With a heavy sigh, Daniel made a decision. He couldn't live in this limbo any longer. He would need to find the truth, and to do that, he had to confront the one person who held the answers, Emily. The next morning, he called her. The conversation was brief, but tense, as Emily agreed to meet him. He needed to look her in the eye. He needed to hear more, and somehow, he hoped he could find clarity in the face of the woman who had shared his life, who had been the mother of his children, at least he had thought she was. Later that day, they met at a small cafe on the outskirts of town. Emily was already sitting at a table when Daniel arrived, her hands folded in front of her, looking like someone who had carried a heavy burden for far too long. "Daniel," she greeted him softly, but there was a tremor in her voice that betrayed the composure she was trying to maintain. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You said some of the kids aren't mine. How do you know that?" Emily exhaled, her gaze flickering toward the window. "I didn't want to tell you. I should have told you sooner. But I didn't know how to say it, or if you'd even believe me. But when we were married, there were others. Other men. Affairs. I didn't think it mattered at the time, because I wanted to believe you were the only one who mattered. But it's been eating at me, Daniel. Eating at me every day." Daniel's mind spun, each word sinking deeper into him, pushing him further from the man he thought he was. "And you just kept it to yourself all these years?" "I didn't know how to fix it," Emily whispered. "I didn't think it was fixable. But now, I think you deserve to know. I'm sorry." A silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of everything unspoken. Daniel's hands tightened around his coffee cup, the heat of the mug barely registering as the shock began to dissipate into something else, a hollow ache in his chest. "What do you want from me, Emily?" he asked, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "What do you want me to do with this? Because you're asking me to question everything, my life, my children, everything." "I'm not asking for anything, Daniel," she said quietly. "I just need you to know. I've spent years hiding this, and it's not fair to you or to them. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect anything. I just want you to have the truth." Daniel took a deep breath, trying to steady his thoughts. "And the kids? The ones who might not be mine? What do I do with them? What do I tell them?" Emily shifted uncomfortably, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I don't know. You can't undo the past, but you have to make the choice. You always have. They're still your children in every way that matters. But I don't want you to live a lie." Daniel didn't know how long they sat there talking, in quiet murmurs, sifting through the wreckage of their shared history. By the time he left the cafe, he had made a decision. He couldn't face this alone. He had to find out the truth once and for all. He needed answers, and that meant confronting the paternity of the children. The days that followed were filled with a heavy, uncertain air. Daniel felt as though he were walking through a fog, the clarity of his life now clouded by questions he couldn't immediately answer. Sophie remained his constant, grounding him with quiet strength, but even her presence couldn't shake the feeling that something irreparable had shifted. He began the difficult task of investigating the truth, contacting doctors, arranging genetic tests, and preparing for what was sure to be an emotional journey. He kept the matter to himself, unwilling to burden Sophie with the full scope of his plan until he had some answers. The results came a week later. The doctor's office was quiet, sterile, the scent of antiseptic sharp in the air. Daniel sat in the waiting room, his leg bouncing nervously as he replayed every conversation he'd had with Emily, every moment of his life with the children. The door opened, and the doctor called his name. Daniel stood up, his heart pounding, and followed him down a narrow hallway to the small office at the back of the clinic. "Mr. Barrett, I have the results here," the doctor said, handing him a manila envelope. "This is the paternity test you requested. We've confirmed the results for each child." Daniel's fingers tightened around the envelope as he nodded. "Thank you." The doctor gave him a sympathetic look before he left, leaving Daniel alone with the truth. For a long moment, Daniel sat in the chair, the envelope burning in his hands. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, and he could feel the anxiety creeping up his spine. With a steady breath, he tore open the envelope, his eyes scanning. The pages, as they revealed what he had both feared and hoped for, answers. The first child, no match. The second, no match. But the third, the youngest one, the child who had always felt so much like him, he was his flesh and blood. Daniel sat there for a long while, staring at the test results in silence. The truth, laid bare in black and white, was a bitter pill to swallow. The children he had raised, loved, fought for, they weren't his. The anger that had simmered beneath the surface for years now surged forward, hot and fierce. He felt betrayed not only by Emily, but by the life he thought he'd built. And yet, even in his rage, there was a thread of sadness, of grief for the children who, despite everything, had been his heart. He didn't know what to do next. The weight of this knowledge was almost too much to bear. But he couldn't let it destroy him. He couldn't let this truth fracture his family any more than it already had. That evening, Sophie waited for him when he returned home. She could see it in his eyes, the heaviness, the deep hurt that seemed to have settled within him. She didn't need to ask what had happened. The truth was written across his face. She walked over to him, sitting down beside him on the couch. "Do you want to talk about it?" she asked softly. Daniel let out a long sigh, the weight of everything crashing down on him. "The test results, they're not what I expected. The first two, they're not mine. But the youngest, she is." Sophie's breath caught in her throat, her hand instinctively reaching for his. "I'm so sorry, Daniel. I can't imagine what you're feeling right now, but no matter what, I'm here. You don't have to go through this alone." Daniel nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I've spent years thinking I was their father, Sophie. I raised them, loved them, protected them. And now, it feels like everything I thought I knew is gone." Sophie held his gaze, her voice steady. "But you've been their father, Daniel, in every way that counts. And you don't have to let this change that if you don't want it to. You're not defined by the paternity of the children you've raised. You've been their father all along, and you still can be. But you get to decide what comes next." The weight of Sophie's words settled over him, soothing some of the sting. But there was still so much left to untangle. He needed to confront Emily, to face the woman who had shattered the life he'd once thought was solid. The next morning, he did what he had avoided for so long. He called her. They met at a park, the same park where they had spent so many afternoons when the children were small. The swing sets were empty now, the playground eerily silent as the two of them sat. On a weathered bench beneath a large oak tree, Emily's face was drawn, her eyes tired, as if the years of hiding the truth had taken a physical toll on her. "I got the results," Daniel said quietly, holding up the envelope, now crumpled from his grip. "It's true. Some of them aren't mine." Emily flinched at the words, her expression crumbling as the weight of the truth settled on her. "I didn't want this, Daniel. I never wanted to hurt you." "You didn't think it mattered," Daniel said, his voice a mixture of anger and sorrow. "But it does. It always has." She lowered her head, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The following days were a blur of decisions. Daniel felt as if his life had been thrown into a storm and was now helplessly adrift, trying to regain control. He found himself questioning everything: his past, his choices, his trust. The quiet moments with Sophie were the only reprieve he had, and even then, the weight of the situation loomed over them both. Sophie had been supportive as always, but Daniel couldn't shake the guilt. He wasn't sure how to rebuild his life, how to look at the children the same way, how to reconcile what he thought was truth with the painful reality. But Sophie was steadfast. She encouraged him to take his time to process the feelings that were sure to come and to lean on her when needed. It was one evening when the house felt especially still that Daniel found himself staring at the family, portraits hanging on the wall. He had placed them there proudly, each frame capturing a milestone of their lives: birthdays, school plays, family vacations. Now, they all felt like ghosts, remnants of a life that never truly existed. Sophie walked into the room, her eyes scanning the portraits as well. She was quiet for a moment, before her voice broke the silence. "What are you thinking?" Daniel turned to her, his expression worn. "I'm thinking about what comes next, about how to move forward, and about what it means to be a father now." Sophie joined him by the wall, standing side by side. She placed a hand gently on his arm. "You don't have to figure it all out in one day. Just take it one step at a time." Daniel nodded, but the uncertainty was still there. He had to find a way to reconcile the truth of who the children really were with the deep love he felt for them. Even though they weren't his by blood, they had always been his by heart. He knew he had to decide if that bond would remain or if the betrayal would tear it apart. The next few weeks passed in a haze of legal meetings, therapy sessions, and awkward exchanges with Emily. There was an unspoken agreement between them. Now, they both knew things could never be the same. Emily was working through her own regrets, but she was also distant, as if the weight of her actions had driven a wedge between them that couldn't easily be undone. But it wasn't just Emily that Daniel had to confront. He couldn't avoid the children forever. The question that loomed largest in his mind was how to tell them the truth. How could he possibly explain everything to them when he barely understood it himself? It was the youngest, Emma, the one who was truly his daughter, that first approached him. She was quiet, as usual, but there was a heaviness in her gaze that suggested she knew something was wrong. She was too young to understand the full extent of what had happened, but her intuition, that innate connection between father and child, told her something had changed. One evening, as Daniel was cleaning up after dinner, Emma came into the kitchen, standing silently in the doorway for a moment before speaking. "Daddy," she said softly, her voice tentative, "are you okay?" The simplicity of her question hit him like a wave, and Daniel had to swallow the lump in his throat before answering. "I'm fine, sweetie," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Just a little tired, that's all." But Emma didn't buy it. She stepped closer, her little face searching his with a kind of wisdom that felt beyond her years. "Are you sure? You've been sad a lot?" Daniel crouched down to her level, brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. She had always been perceptive, a quiet observer of the world around her. And in that moment, he realized that no matter what the tests had shown, Emma was still his. He would always be her father, no matter what blood ran through her veins. "I'm just figuring some things out," he said quietly. "But I'll be okay. I'm here with you, okay?" Emma nodded, her face brightening a little. "Okay, Daddy." The conversation ended there. But it wasn't the end of the journey. Daniel knew he would have to eventually sit down with all the kids, his kids, regardless of the truth of their parentage, and have the hard conversation. He had no idea how to tell them, or even if he should, but he knew that day was coming. Weeks turned into months, and slowly, Daniel began to rebuild his sense of self. He still felt broken at times, still wondered if his life had been a lie, But he found solace in the quiet moments, the ones where he held his children close and reminded himself of the love they had shared. That love wasn't conditional. It didn't depend on biology. It depended on care, on sacrifice, on every sleepless night and every tear wiped away. Sophie continued to be his rock, offering him space when he needed it and comfort when the weight of his thoughts became too much. They had talked about the future, about what their relationship might look like going forward, but for now, the uncertainty was part of the process. It wasn't easy. As the months passed, Daniel's world began to find its new rhythm. His life, once filled with the chaos of hidden truths and shattered illusions, started to take on a different shape. The cracks in his foundation hadn't disappeared, but they had settled into something more familiar, an acceptance that life, even in its darkest moments, had a way of pushing forward. Daniel knew that he was healing, but healing was never linear. There were still times when he would wake in the middle of the night, his thoughts clouded with confusion and the weight of everything that had been torn apart. But Sophie was always there. Their relationship, once tentative, began to solidify into something deep and resilient. They found strength in each other, their bond growing with every conversation, every shared look that spoke volumes. One evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset, Sophie broke the silence. "I know it's been hard," she began, her voice soft, filled with care. "But I think we've come a long way, haven't we?" Daniel nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. "I feel like I'm standing on the edge of a new life, one I didn't expect, but maybe one I need." Sophie's smile was gentle, understanding. "The old life, it's gone now. But that doesn't mean you can't build something new. We can build it together." He leaned back in his chair, watching the fading colors of the sky, the peace of the evening soothing him in a way he hadn't thought possible. "I know. I've thought about that a lot, about how things can change so fast, and how the past doesn't just fade away. But I think I'm ready to face it, and maybe let go of the things I can't change." Sophie reached over, her hand finding his. "Let go, but don't forget. Those pieces of your past, they shape you, but they don't have to control you." For a moment, Daniel sat in quiet contemplation, feeling the weight of her words settle in his chest. He didn't need to forget what had happened. He just needed to stop letting it define him. But as time passed, there were still moments when the truth of Emily's betrayal lingered at the edges of his thoughts, especially when the children were around. Emma, still the most perceptive of the bunch, often sought him out when she noticed he seemed distant, as if her quiet concern was a bridge to something deeper, something unspoken. One afternoon, as Daniel was walking through the house, he heard Emma's voice calling him from the living room. He walked in to find her sitting on the couch, her expression serious, her small hands twisting a stuffed bear in her lap. "Daddy," she said, her voice steady but full of quiet concern. "I don't understand something." Daniel's heart twisted in his chest. "What is it, sweetie?" Emma looked up at him, her wide eyes searching his face. "Are we still your family, even though everything happened?" The question hit Daniel harder than he expected. In some ways, he had feared it, knowing the day would come when one of the kids would feel the need to ask. He sat down beside her, his mind racing, trying to find the right words. "Of course you are," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "You are my family. You've always been my family. Nothing changes that, Emma." Emma gave him a small, relieved smile, but her gaze lingered on him, as if trying to figure out if he really believed what he was saying. The truth was, he wasn't sure. but he knew he needed to believe it. For her, for all of them. Days passed, and Daniel tried his best to shield the children from the heavier aspects of the situation, while still being honest with them in a way that didn't overwhelm them. The strain in his relationship with Emily continued to grow, their interactions more strained and distant than ever. Every attempt at conversation felt like a minefield, both of them trapped in the aftermath of her choices. The consequences, too. Big to ignore, but too painful to confront. Emily seemed to drift further away, consumed by her guilt and her own self-loathing, yet still unwilling to fully face the damage she had caused. Then, one evening, Daniel found himself face to face with Emily for what he could only assume was a final reckoning. It had been weeks since they had spoken about anything of significance, but as he sat at the kitchen table, watching her enter the room with hesitance in her step, Daniel knew this was the moment they could no longer avoid. "Daniel," Emily said quietly, her voice thick with something he couldn't quite place. "I know I've done things that can't be undone, and I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even know if I can forgive myself." Daniel studied her carefully, the woman he had once loved so deeply, now a stranger in his life. "You should have thought about that before you destroyed everything, Emily." "I know," she whispered. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I'm just asking for a chance to make things right, even if it's just with the kids." As the days turned into weeks, Daniel's life began to settle into a routine. The initial chaos, the whirlwind of emotions and revelations, had calmed. Yet the emptiness of the spaces once filled with deceit still lingered, as if the shadows of the past refused to be fully dispelled. But he didn't let it consume him anymore. Instead, he focused on rebuilding, not just his life, but the trust of the children who needed him to be whole. The conversation with Emily had been a turning point, one that Daniel knew wasn't the end of their story, but the beginning of something new. For the first time in months, he felt the possibility of peace, though it was a peace that didn't come without its own struggles. He found himself spending more time with Sophie, their relationship deepening in unexpected ways. The connection between them had always been grounded in mutual respect, but now it was beginning to evolve into something stronger, something more resilient. Sophie had never judged him for his past, never questioned his pain or his doubts. She accepted him as he was now, scarred but whole. And in return, Daniel found himself opening up to her in ways he hadn't thought possible. They spent quiet evenings together, often just sitting in silence, their presence enough to soothe each other. Sophie had become more than just a partner. She was a sanctuary from the storm that had once threatened to drown him. Their shared moments of peace were rare but precious, and Daniel began to understand that this was what he had been searching for. But life had a way of surprising him, and the past wasn't done just yet. One morning, Daniel received a letter. It was sealed with an official-looking stamp, the kind he had seen in legal offices and courtrooms. He hesitated, staring at it for a moment before opening it. Inside, he found a single sheet of paper, straightforward, impersonal, yet carrying the weight of a truth that would alter the course of his life once again. It was a DNA test result. His heart sank as he scanned the page. Some of his children were not biologically his. Daniel's hands shook as the realization set in. The shock of it hit him like a tidal wave, dragging him under, threatening to drown him in the weight of the truth. He hadn't expected more revelations, not after everything that had happened. But this was an undeniable twist, one that no amount of preparation could have made him ready for. The document confirmed what he had suspected for some time, but hadn't fully allowed himself to believe. He didn't need a test to tell him what his heart already knew. But seeing it in black and white, seeing the names and the genetic markers laid out so clinically, it made the betrayal feel even more real. The shock didn't last long. Replaced quickly, by a cold fury that burned deep in his chest. This was the last thread, the final insult. Emily's actions had now affected not just his heart, but his entire identity as a father. He had loved those children as his own, raised them, protected them, and now he was being told that part of his family wasn't even his. Daniel's mind raced with questions. Who were the fathers? How had this happened without his knowledge? Was it all part of Emily's plan to keep him in the dark? Or had it been a series of decisions, one after another, that led them both down this path of destruction? He couldn't stay in the house any longer. He needed answers, and he needed to see Emily. Within hours, Daniel was standing outside her door, the letter clenched tightly in his hand. The confrontation he had avoided for so long had come, but this time, it wasn't just about betrayal. It was about his children, his legacy, and the years he had lost in ignorance. Emily answered the door with a startled look. She hadn't expected him. Not like this, not after everything that had happened. Her expression quickly shifted from surprise to a guarded, unreadable mask. "Daniel," she said softly, almost as if she were bracing herself. "What are you doing here?" He held up the letter, his voice steady but filled with an emotion he could barely control. "We need to talk." Emily's face paled as she saw the document. "You shouldn't have seen that. No," Daniel interrupted, his voice tight. "No more lies, Emily. You've lied to me for so long that I don't even know who you are anymore. I thought I knew you. I thought I knew everything." Her eyes filled with tears, but they didn't move him. He had no more space for her guilt, her regret. Not anymore. "Some of my children aren't mine," he said, his words slicing through the air. "How do you explain that?" Emily opened her mouth, but no words came. She stared at him as if she were looking for a way out. But there was none. The truth was out, and it was suffocating them both. "I didn't mean for it to happen this way," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "I never wanted to hurt you. But I was lost, Daniel, and I made choices I'll never be able to take back." The weeks that followed were a blur of legal meetings, endless phone calls, and sleepless nights. Daniel had already started the painful process of untangling his life from Emily's web of deceit. The truth, brutal and unrelenting, continued to echo in his mind. His children weren't all his. And even now, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more he didn't know, more secrets buried deep beneath the surface. Emily's attempts at reconciliation were half-hearted at best, and the guilt in her eyes was a constant reminder of the past he was trying to leave behind. Her apologies, though sincere, felt hollow. Nothing she could say would erase the years of betrayal, the time he had spent living a lie. Daniel filed for divorce, but that didn't bring the closure he had hoped for. Instead, it opened a floodgate of questions that he couldn't ignore. Why had Emily done this? Was it simply a moment of weakness, or had this affair been planned from the start? But what truly haunted him were the children. His children. He loved them deeply, and the thought that some of them weren't his by blood stung more than he could have ever imagined. He had no intention of abandoning them. His role as their father was not defined by genetics, but the weight of it all still pressed on his chest, like a vice. He sought the advice of a therapist, hoping to make sense of the chaos swirling around him. It was during one of these sessions that he began to truly confront the gravity of the situation. The therapy wasn't just about understanding the betrayal, it was about understanding himself, his choices, his reactions, and most importantly, how he would move forward. It was in one of these quiet sessions that the therapist, Dr. Lambert, helped him recognize something important. "Daniel," Dr. Lambert said gently, "you've been caught in a cycle of pain for so long that you've forgotten the most important part of this journey: your healing. This isn't just about what Emily did or didn't do. It's about what you choose to do with the truth now. You can let it define you, or you can define yourself beyond it. Those words lingered with him long after the session ended. Daniel realized he was right. He couldn't keep letting the past hold him hostage. His life, his future, wasn't going to be shaped by Emily's mistakes. It was time to regain control. But before he could make any headway on that path, another bombshell dropped. One evening, as Daniel was preparing dinner for himself and the kids, there was a knock at the door. He opened it to find a woman standing there, her face familiar, yet he couldn't quite place her. She was older than him, with a serious, no-nonsense air about her. "I'm Detective Martinez," she said, flashing her badge. "May I come in?" "Detective?" Daniel echoed, confused. He stepped aside, allowing her to enter. "Is everything okay?" She studied him carefully, her gaze sharp. "I have some information that concerns you. It's about Emily." Daniel's stomach churned, a sense of dread rising within him. "What's going on?" "She's in trouble," Martinez replied bluntly. "Serious trouble. It involves the children, the ones you think aren't yours." Daniel's pulse quickened, his mind racing. "What do you mean? What's happened?" Martinez hesitated for a moment before answering. "There's evidence that suggests Emily may have been involved in something larger, financial fraud. And there are links to those children, those that you're not biologically related to. We believe she may have been using your identity in some way, but we're still investigating the full scope." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. His mind spun as he tried to process the new information. Emily wasn't just a liar. She was part of something criminal. But how deep did it go? And why had he never suspected? "Detective, are you saying," Daniel started, struggling to keep his voice steady, "that some of the children might be a part of it?" Martinez finished for him. "Yes. We don't know all the details yet, but it's clear she was involved in something shady. And we believe she may have been using her relationship with you and the children as a front." Daniel felt his knees weaken, and he grabbed onto the doorframe for support. His entire world, already fractured by betrayal, was now splintering further. "Why come to me now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why not before?" Martinez's expression softened just slightly. "We needed you to understand. What was at stake? We couldn't tell you until we had enough evidence to back up our suspicions. We've been monitoring her for months, but we needed someone close to her to confirm certain things. You've been living in the middle of all this without realizing it." Daniel's head spun. His first instinct was to push it all away, to run from the mess of it. But he knew he couldn't. The truth was catching up with him in ways he never expected. And now it seemed that Emily's betrayal wasn't just personal, it was criminal. The following days felt like they were passing in a haze, a blur of confusion and disbelief. Daniel couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. The realization that his family had been caught up in something so dark, so much bigger than he could have ever imagined, gnawed at him relentlessly. His thoughts bounced between his children, Emily's betrayal, and the ominous promise of even deeper secrets yet to be uncovered. What if this was just the tip of the iceberg? How far did this deception go? As the investigation into Emily's possible criminal activity progressed, Daniel found himself drawn into an uncomfortable new role. No longer just the wronged husband, he was now a key witness, someone with crucial information about Emily's life, her lies, and perhaps even the illegal actions she had committed. Detective Martinez had warned him that things could get worse before they got better, but Daniel wasn't sure what worse even meant anymore. Then, the phone rang. "Daniel, it's me, Detective Martinez." Her voice crackled through the receiver, urgent and clipped. "I need you to come down to the station. There's something you need to see." He didn't hesitate. The gnawing curiosity, the need for answers, pulled him out the door and into his car. The drive to the police station was agonizing, every mile stretching longer than the last. He wasn't sure what he was walking into, but he knew it was going to change everything. When he arrived, Martinez was waiting for him in a small, dimly lit room. She gestured for him to sit, her face tense. "I don't know how to explain this, Daniel, but we've uncovered something disturbing." He took a seat, his heart pounding in his chest. "What is it?" Martinez slid a folder across the table. Daniel's fingers trembled as he opened it, revealing a set of photographs. At first glance, they seemed innocuous. Just family photos, pictures of Emily with the kids, moments that should have been ordinary, happy memories. But then, Daniel's eyes caught something in the background of one of the photos, something he couldn't unsee. A man, a stranger standing just behind Emily. His presence was subtle but unmistakable, and there was a look in his eyes. Something cold, something calculating. The man was positioned in the shadows, but his face was clear. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. "Who is this?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Martinez leaned forward, her expression grave. "We've been digging into Emily's contacts, trying to figure out who she might have been working with. This man's name is Thomas Archer. He's connected to a series of offshore accounts and shell companies. We believe he's been laundering money for some time, using Emily's name and your family's identity to cover his tracks." Daniel felt the world spin beneath him. "But why? Why involve me? Why the kids?" Martinez sighed. "It's complicated, but we think Emily was part of a larger scheme. She's been working with Archer for years, and part of that arrangement involved using your family as a front. The kids, they're part of something that goes way beyond what we initially thought. It's not just about money laundering. There are ties to organized crime, illegal businesses, things we still don't fully understand." Daniel's mind reeled. It felt as though the ground had disappeared beneath him, leaving him with nothing but an abyss of uncertainty. His family, the people he loved, had been pawns in a game far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. And Emily, his wife, had willingly played along, using their life together as a cover for something criminal. As he sat there, stunned by the weight of it all, Detective Martinez's voice cut through the fog of his thoughts. "We think Emily's in over her head," she said quietly. "And she's not the only one who's been hiding things. Daniel, we need your help. We need to know everything you can remember about her life before you met, about anyone she might have been involved with. The more you can tell us, the better chance we have of stopping this before it escalates further." Daniel felt a pang of anger rise within him. How could she have done this? How could Emily have lied so effortlessly, for so long, pulling him and the kids into something so dangerous without a second thought? And now, he was being asked to help bring it all crashing down. But as he looked at the photographs again, at the shadowy figure of Thomas Archer lurking just behind his family's image, he knew there was no going back. The truth was darker than he had ever thought possible, and now he had no choice but to confront it head-on. "I'll help," he said, his voice steady but tinged with bitterness. "I'll do whatever it takes." Martinez nodded, her eyes narrowing, with a mixture of respect and concern. "Good, because it's about to get a lot worse, Daniel. We're digging into a network of people who will stop at nothing to protect their interests. You need to be careful." As the days wore on, Daniel found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, wondering who he could trust and who might be a part of the web of deception that had ensnared his life. His once peaceful, predictable existence had crumbled into chaos, and each new discovery only deepened the mystery of Emily's betrayal. The police, led by Detective Martinez, were moving swiftly, following every lead they could find on Thomas Archer and the criminal syndicate that had wrapped its tendrils around Daniel's family. But with each step closer, they came to unraveling the truth. The danger seemed to escalate. Emily, too, had become more elusive. The woman he had once known was now a fugitive, operating in the shadows, her every move calculated and carefully concealed. One evening, as Daniel sat at his desk, sorting through the overwhelming evidence he had gathered, the doorbell rang. His heart skipped a beat. It was late, far later than anyone should have been visiting. With a glance through the peephole, he saw a familiar face. Detective Martinez. He opened the door without hesitation, but the look on her face told him everything he needed to know. "Daniel, we need to talk," she said quietly, stepping inside. "Is it about Emily?" he asked, his voice tight with tension. Martinez nodded. "Yes. It's worse than we thought. Archer has gone underground. He's vanished. And Emily, she's not just in hiding. We think she's been orchestrating everything from the beginning. She's playing a much larger game than we realized." Daniel felt the weight of her words settle in his chest. "What do you mean? What is she really involved in?" Martinez exhaled slowly, rubbing her temples. "We've discovered evidence, linking Emily not just to Archer and his laundering operations, but to several high-profile criminal figures, people with influence. This was never just about money. Emily was a player in something far more dangerous, a network that reaches into politics, law enforcement, even corporate giants. She was gathering information, using your family as a cover, while she worked her way up the ranks." Daniel's mind was reeling. The woman he had married, the mother of his children, had she truly been playing him all along? A part of him couldn't accept it, but the evidence was undeniable. And now, as the investigation dug deeper, it was clear that Emily's betrayal was more elaborate than he could have ever imagined. "We're running out of time," Martinez continued, her voice urgent. "Archer's associates are getting more desperate. They know we're closing in, and they'll do anything to protect their operation. We need to find Emily, Daniel. She's the key to bringing this all down. And the longer she's out there, the more dangerous it gets. For you, for the kids, for everyone." Daniel's heart pounded. The thought of Emily on the run, still controlling the strings from behind, the scenes, sent a shiver down his spine. And with every passing moment, he knew the noose was tightening. She wasn't just hiding from the law, she was preparing to make her final move. "Where do we start?" Daniel asked, the determination in his voice replacing the fear that had gripped him before. Martinez paused, her gaze serious. "We've managed to track down a few of Emily's contacts. There's one in particular, Lena Garcia. She's a known associate of Archer's. She might know where Emily is hiding. We need you to help us get to her. If we can get to Lena, we'll have the information we need to find Emily." The plan was risky. Lena was known to be cautious, paranoid even. She wouldn't give up anything easily. But Daniel had no choice. If he wanted to end this, to stop the madness Emily had set into motion, he would have to take this final step. The following night, Daniel and Martinez staked out a rundown building on the outskirts of town. Lena's name had come up in several of their leads, and they knew this was where she had been spotted recently. As they watched from the shadows, Daniel's thoughts were consumed by his family, the kids. What had they been dragged into? How much of this would they ever understand? He couldn't bear the thought of them being affected by the darkness he had uncovered. But as the door to the building opened, he saw her, Lena Garcia, stepping into the alley. This was it. Without a word, he and Martinez moved swiftly, closing the distance between them and Lena. As they cornered her, Lena's eyes widened in shock, but there was something else there too. Fear, recognition. She knew who they were, and she knew why they were there. "Where is she?" Daniel demanded, his voice cold and steady. "Tell us where Emily is." Lena shook her head, a bitter smile creeping onto her face. "You really don't get it, do You? She sneered. She's gone, Daniel. She's not hiding. She's not on the run. She's gone to take what's hers. Daniel's confusion deepened. What are you talking about? Who is she working with? Lena's gaze flicked toward the street, as though weighing her options. Daniel's heart raced, but he stood motionless, as if frozen in time. He could feel the sharp sting of betrayal in his chest, heavier now than ever. Emily's words echoed in his mind. Closer than you think. The finality in her voice sent a shiver down his spine. He wasn't just dealing with a wife who had betrayed him. He was facing an opponent who was in control of the game. As the days passed, the walls seemed to close in on him. No matter where he turned, Emily's shadow loomed large, taunting him with her elusiveness. The investigation, though persistent, was hitting dead ends. Martinez had warned him not to act impulsively, but Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. If Emily was going to make her final move, he needed to be ready. One afternoon, as Daniel sat at his kitchen table sifting through the documents that had once felt like the key to unraveling everything, he heard a faint knock at the door. He froze. This was it. His heart thudded painfully in his chest as he slowly rose to his feet and moved toward the door. Was it Emily? Was she finally here? He hesitated for a moment before opening the door. But it wasn't Emily who stood there. It was a man he didn't recognize, wearing a dark coat and an air of calm urgency. His face was unreadable, but his eyes held a sharpness that made Daniel uneasy. "You're Daniel Forsythe, correct?" the man asked, his voice low and steady. "Yes, that's me." "Who are you?" Daniel asked, trying to mask the suspicion in his voice. "I'm David Rains. I've been following the situation you're in, and I'm here because I think we can help each other." Daniel's mind raced. Was this another one of Emily's contacts, a part of her network? His instincts told him to slam the door in the man's face, but something in the stranger's demeanor suggested he was more than just another player in Emily's game. "I don't need any more help," Daniel said, his voice firm yet tinged with frustration. "I'm handling this myself." Rains raised an eyebrow but didn't back away. "I understand, but you're not seeing the bigger picture here. Emily Forsythe is not who you think she is. I know things you don't." Daniel's pulse quickened. The name Emily Forsythe sounded cold and distant when said like that. This man knew her, and he was offering something. What exactly? "What do you mean?" Daniel asked, his voice barely a whisper. Rains stepped closer, his voice lowering even further. "Emily isn't just hiding from you, Daniel. She's not trying to escape. She's preparing for something far bigger. She's been planning this for years. You've been nothing but a pawn in her game." Daniel's mind was in turmoil. His every instinct told him to reject the man, to refuse his offer of help. But the weight of Rains's words had struck a chord. Emily had always been a mystery, calculating, manipulative, but could she really be behind something so massive, so dangerous, that it involved people and networks Daniel couldn't even begin to comprehend? "I don't trust you," Daniel said, trying to steady his breathing. "Why should I?" Rains seemed unfazed by the accusation. "Because I have the truth, and if you want to get her, if you want to end this, you'll have to work with me." There was a pause, heavy with unspoken tension. Rains continued. "There's a place, a meeting, happening soon. A gathering of people who will do anything to protect their interests. Emily will be there. She'll be pulling the strings. If you want to stop her once and for all, you'll need to confront her directly. But you'll need to be prepared. It's not going to be easy, and it won't be clean. You'll have to decide, Daniel. Are you ready to face the truth?" Daniel's mind raced, but deep down, he knew the answer. He wasn't just chasing a ghost anymore. He wasn't just trying to find his wife. He was fighting for his family's future, for the truth that had eluded him for so long. The man was offering him a way in, the chance to end the nightmare once and for all. "I'll do whatever it takes," Daniel said, his voice steady now, with a newfound resolve. Raines nodded, his face unreadable. "Good. Meet me tonight, at the warehouse on Willow Street. Come alone?" Daniel nodded sharply, not trusting himself to speak. As Raines turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the street, Daniel stood there, the weight of the decision pressing heavily on his chest. Tonight would be the night that everything came to a head. He needed to be ready. Emily had thought she was the one in control, but she had underestimated him. Now it was his turn to play the game, and he wasn't going to lose. As the night drew closer, Daniel prepared himself. He couldn't afford to make mistakes. Every piece of the puzzle was falling into place, and he was finally beginning to see the bigger picture. Emily had been playing him, manipulating him for years, using their family as a pawn in a dangerous game, but no longer.